Hey everyone, I am Kat B.
And I'm Angel Street.
And we are the hosts of the webcast UFOT.
But we love coffee and UFOs.
Hi, I'm Stephen Bassett, Executive Director of Paradigm Research Group, and I'm a really big supporter of coffee and UFOs.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Coffee and UFOs on the Mystic Lounge YouTube channel. Thank you so much for joining me for this very special episode. Joining me is a roundtable of really special scientists, one of which is Dr. Bob Davis. He's the author of Unseen Forces. Bob's been on Mystic Lounge and Coffee and UFOs multiple times. Love Bob. So glad he's here with us. And we have another special guest joining as well, Garry Nolan of Stanford Medicine. Many of you in the UFO world are aware of both of these two fine-minded individuals. So we'll get to that in just a moment. As a friendly reminder, if you like this podcast, please subscribe, comment down below, share the link, and click the notification bell on the YouTube channel. Of course, if you listen to the audio version as well, any comments and reviews and ratings would be really, really appreciated. So thank you so much for joining us today. And now we bring on our esteemed guests. Garry, Bob, how are you?
I'm doing well.
Great, thank you.
All right, thanks for joining us today. So tonight's roundtable discussion is primarily focusing on the science of investigatory practices of UFOs and UAPs. So we're in an era now where there are more and more trained PhD level, master's degree level practicing scientists with reputations that are going out and actually looking into this phenomena. For a long time, there have been amateurs like myself and other investigators. I'm a New York MUFON investigator, and there's that collective of amateurs there that I really, really do appreciate. And I think that we would really benefit from novel thinking. So you two have been investigating this phenomena for a while in your own way. I know, Garry, it's something of a hobby. Bob, you are prolifically writing on the topic, specifically in the consciousness aspect of this. So, Garry, since this is the first time you've been on the podcast, can you tell us a little bit about, what you see as an important approach to understanding the UAP phenomena?
Well, it's something that I've remarked upon before, and I'm sure Bob has seen this as well. There's the difference between an anecdote and your personal experience and what you basically believe because of personal observations versus how it is that you talk about that to other scientists. Mm-hmm. And the whole credibility issue in terms of the outside world, to me at least, is dependent upon how it is that we define how we talk about it and the kinds of language that we use, first of all. And then second, how is it you form a hypothesis about testing something so ephemeral that then you can translate to other scientists to get them to go along for the ride with you? Somehow I don't hear you now, Alan. You're off.
That's the aspect of this that I would really find interesting if we look at it from a consciousness perspective. So Bob, really quick, from that perspective, how do you approach this subject?
Well, we don't know what consciousness is. We don't know what these non-human intelligences are, UAPs are, and we're trying to figure out at least what aspect, at least that angle of the phenomenon, the non-physical, besides the physical. In fact, we have to figure out if we're looking at different phenomena when we talk about UAPs. So we're looking at orbs versus physical craft versus other types of structures that may be interacting with us and come in different shapes and forms. Some may be common to our planet as just a separate life form. Who knows? But we don't have the language, as Garry says. Our definition of the terms that we use, like consciousness, non-human intelligence, etc., are so loosely defined, poorly understood, and yet we try to make comparisons between two enigmas, which is impossible. So suggestions at best, is where we stand as far as the science goes. Although there is some science behind it, certainly, and Gary's a leading aspect of that. Me and others will maybe look at the non-physical, the non-scientific aspect in terms of the qualitative, transpersonal changes that occurs in individuals who interact with the phenomenon, different manifestations, and trying to figure out where we need to go is more than a challenging task along these lines. Alan.
Yeah. Considering this is called Coffee and UFOs, is there a place for coffee as an investigative tool in this subject? Is it beneficial to consume coffee?
Well, I think there are other small molecule drugs that people have used to get closer to the event than, say, caffeine.
Yeah, I'm a little familiar. But yes, caffeine is now my favorite mind-altering drug. We'll leave it at that. It's been a long time, but that's funny you say that, Gary, because I've had in my younger years alien-like experiences, an alien kind of a consciousness experience when on something like mushrooms or a psychedelic, and the parallels between those experiences and reported alleged alien abduction experiences and close encounter experiences are very, very similar. So, well, let's get back to that in a moment. Gary, I know you've worked with materials. You've worked with doing brain scans of people who have had encounters in the mechanical world of analysis. What do you think are the best tools that we have on hand?
Well, from the mechanical aspect and the materials, I mean, it really is, I think amongst the best of the tools are things like mass spectrometry, which allow you to measure the elemental and isotopic quantification of these. Now, there's various kinds of mass spectrometry, of course. The ones that I'm most interested in are the ones that give us the ratios of the isotopes. So, I mean, there's any of a number of different scientific approaches to measure just the base properties of a material. But then there are the functional attributes of a material, which are everything from what happens when you do this to it, when you perturb it, when you put it in a certain kind of electric field, or you pass a certain kind of electromagnetic current across it. So, I mean, those are the things which I've been able in my laboratory to apply, because we've used those kinds of tools for pure biology. And it just turns out that the tools that we've developed have, multiple uses. When it comes to measuring the brain or the genetics of individuals, there's a whole host of technologies, which also things that we use in my laboratory. But I think what gets closest to what Bob is doing is the MRIs of the brain, and then the other kinds of functionalities of the brain, fMRI or other kinds of brain analyses that are, you're asking what is the material world aspect, the meat brain doing and the electrical systems doing, while different consciousnesses of your brain, various kinds of conscious attributes that you're using, are functioning. Like when someone who's a supposed psychic or an alleged psychic does something, how does their brain change compared to resting state?
Oh yeah, well, Tyler Henry, who was on the show some months back, he's had his brain measured, right? His brain activity measured, and there was some anomalous activity there.
Yes,
when he was going
theta waves. Yeah,
right. So is that
he's a friend? I mean, acquaintance, I should say, more than anything. But
okay, yeah. So is that something? Do you think that would be noticeable in all of us, or do you think there's only special cases where you see those changes?
Well, I think certainly Tyler is a special case. And I mean, the open question is, if you were to do a more formalized study of such individuals, when they are performing their abilities, whatever those might be, and there's a whole range of them. Does their brain change from their normal resting state versus does their brain change from everybody else's, or is their brain different from everybody else's resting state? And that's just, that is work that is to be done, and I'm involved in doing some of that. But the amount of money that's required to do it is, I think it would shock people.
Yeah, and so, well, I know in the past you've mentioned that you would like to get more data, or you have more data that you're working towards, as far as like the metamaterials, like the alleged crashed saucer metallic piece of metal that's bismuth and magnesium, right? And it has those odd spikes, and it looks like it's laid like a nano layer purposely. So is that the problem? Do we need more funding to get?
Absolutely. I mean, everything I've done has been basically out of pocket.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that it hasn't already been done in some quarters. Just the information has not really been disseminated properly. I mean, I have seen some of the results from, not from like secret programs or anything, but of the bismuth that was done by the government. And I just don't think that the work was done to the level of quality that's really required. And mostly not because they couldn't do it. It's just because the people it was given it to just it was like, do I have to do this? And they didn't do it right.
Right. So that's the thing, is if you're studying something from one angle because you have to, rather than approaching it from different angles. And actually, that kind of reminds me of, I think last year you were talking about developing an atom, an atomic.
It's taking advantage of an instrument that's already out there that can get you down to around, let's say 5 nanometers, 5 angstrom resolution, which is close to the exact atomic positioning of things.
So you're scanning the atom so that you can see all of its positions.
Yes.
At once.
In a very small volume of space. It's not, you can't do it like, I can't scan you and get you ready for a teleportation, but I can, I can disassemble a very small part of you.
Oh, great.
And, and move that along. But I think, it's, again, I think I just even did sort of a little Twitter tutorial a few days ago on the difference between isotope ratios and exact positioning of atoms and why you would want to know that. And it doesn't tell you how it functions, but it gives you a sense of what's there. So if you can see how it's put together, the architecture, you might be able to divine a potential function by saying, oh, well, that looks like a this. It does, or could do that.
Right. And so that's that kind of multi approach that I think that we need for a long time. As I've mentioned in an email, we use tools like a Geiger counter, we use the EMF meter.
Right.
Each of those by themselves is nice. It could be helpful, but when you're measuring multiple effects of a close encounter or a sighting, then you have more to work with. So in your dream world, what if you knew, okay, there's going to be a UAP flying by at this time, what would you like to have with you?
Well, if there was something flying by at the time,
if you knew a UAP was there.
I'd like to have basically some kind of an accelerometer, or there's approaches that you can use for measuring very small changes in time. And so that would give you something about what's called essentially an inference of a change in local gravity. Basically everything that Avi Loeb is putting together for his telescope operations. I mean, I'm part of the Galileo project. So, if you want a list of what should be done, it really is what they're doing is the right thing. And they're putting together all these telescopes, one already on the Harvard Observatory. And then I think they're cloning them in multiple places, and then Avi's doing the next best thing in terms of getting a hold of pieces of these. He's currently down, I think he's still down in the South Pacific on a deep sea trawler, collecting pieces of metal from the bottom of the ocean that he, hypothesizes might have come from an exploding extrasolar meteor that, because of its attributes, was let's say it seemed to be strong enough of a piece of material that it didn't look like your average rock. And so he actually just published something this morning on his blog about some interesting things that he found. But he made the right conclusion, is that he's got some early stuff that looks interesting, and he's got basically a few jars of this kind of stuff. He's going to bring it back, and he's going to throw the gamut of analysis tools at it and do it properly.
Yeah, I remember seeing one of his blog posts. He found like a fibrous kind of a material, and had this kind of twist to it. And the meteor, I guess they're calling IM-1 interstellar meteor 1, because that's the first known interstellar meteor in real time, which is amazing. But statistically, I mean, that seems pretty almost outrageous that meteor, that first meteor that we find, would bring in something of an extraterrestrial, intelligently designed material.
It's got to happen somewhere.
But it's got to happen somewhere. Yeah. Bob, what are your thoughts on that?
On what? what equipment I'd like to have if a UAP flew overhead?
On the potential discovery of a material.
It certainly wouldn't surprise me. I'd welcome the opportunity. What does it prove? It's still numerous questions that remain not discovered, but it certainly answers one fundamental one. Where they come from, it didn't come from here. That raises obviously a whole philosophical, scientific diatribe of questions that evolved from that, certainly. But I wish I could understand the physical components of this phenomenon. We're barely scratching the surface on that, and less so regarding the non-physical aspects of it, which are based on the results from the Dr. Jacob Mitchell Research Foundation that I was a member of, wrote a paper on, and published in the Journal of Scientific Exploration. We found that it was largely non-physical, at least 75-80% of the time. Not to say that it is indeed physical, but people report these extraordinary ontological events that lead to possibly what people describe as a unique form of ego dissolution, not unique to UAP interactions, but also to other transformative experiences, from near death to DMT to etc. Question is what's going on, what these awe-inspiring events are doing something to the brain, whether or not that's measurable, that's questionable, but there are some theories that are biologic in nature, but there are also those that are purely cognitive in nature, and you're really not going to, you may not get at it objectively if it is purely cognitive, but nevertheless, I'd love to see some of the MRIs and EEG patterns, everything we could throw at it, when people describe, as they do, the alterations of space-time, entering a holographic universe, as they say, entering a matrix via an out-of-body experience, as many contend. They're trying to put words that pale in terms of defining and capturing the essence of that subjective sensation, perception, etc. But if you can possibly correlate that in ideal conditions, which is impossible since these things occur spontaneously, it would be the best of both worlds. What would be revealed, who knows? But it'd be a step forward. So what do people do now? They look at that individuals who take DMT, like at Johns Hopkins University, and they study their behavioral transformations. Those who are atheists suddenly believe in a supreme being. Not always, but we see a shift in that direction. What is that all about? Besides interacting with non-human entities, again, drawing parallels between that and other spiritually transformative interactions. Are we uncovering Jung's collective unconscious? Are these modules in the brain and are revealed under certain circumstances into our conscious memory? But everybody has it, shares it. It reminds me, however, what what Rick Strassman and John Mack, Rick Strassman, the noted DMT researcher from the University of New Mexico, and of course the noted and late so-called alien abduction phenomenon research, I hate to term it that way, John Mack, they once met to compare their research evidence and results, the DMT versus those who believe they interacted with non-human entities associated with the UAP. And according to Strassman, quote unquote, they were blown away by the similarity of the results. Some preliminary studies suggest that there are similarities, noted obvious differences, of course, but nevertheless, why the similar perceptual alterations, the interactions, the messages received? There are compelling similarities between that and other types of STEs, like the near-death, etc. So what can we learn, in other words, from the DMT brain that we can possibly extrapolate to the UAP brain, if anything? Right. If anything, and that's a long shot right there. But getting to the ontological shock that John Mack discussed, that Jacques Vallée addresses certainly, and the ensuing ego dissolution. We do see brain changes, spare the details. When DMT is ingested, whether or not it suggests these underlying changes in personal viewpoints, philosophical values, etc., that are dramatic in nature, that are generally positive over time from people who do this, even with interaction with UAPs, and like it's a spiritual event. But there's more than that. They receive messages from largely benevolent, intelligent, caring, loving. There's negative galore too. Don't let me downplay that. Very negative interactions, largely positive, and largely over time they're integrated, where the person becomes more humane in many different ways.
Yeah, that's interesting. You say that the ego dissolution. Yes, that's true of the psychedelic experience, or quote unquote mystic experience. But it does seem to affect even pilots or people who have close encounters with UAPs. That there's a kind of psychological shift that occurs, and it appears to me like there is a kind of an ego dissolution of some sort that's occurring there as well. I would imagine, and we're getting, I know, kind of speculative, but if there's a fourth and fifth dimension, let's say, beings that would come from those dimensions, would they not be godlike to us?
Well, maybe we're godlike to them.
That's an interesting thought. I haven't thought of that.
I mean, why do these things seem to show up so often and interact with us? Do they feel sorry for us? Do they feel responsible for us?
Yeah.
I'm not willing to give them more than they're able to prove to us at this point.
I'm down with that for sure. I guess the idea would be if one could move through time, that would seem superior. But like philosophically, you're right, Gary. It didn't even occur to me that even if they could, on a higher dimension, that doesn't make them necessarily a better, sentient being or collection of sentient beings. So is there a way, do you think, is there a future where we can kind of meld these two studies together, the study of the consciousness effects and the actual mechanic measurements of the phenomenon?
Why don't you go ahead and start, Bob? I have a couple of different answers.
Well, maybe you need to ask that question of the DoD. Off the top of my head, I think of the DoD threat scenario where they talk about psychotronic weapons, cognitive human interface. It's referring to that the science exists for an enemy of the United States to manipulate both physical and cognitive environments. That's what they're referring to. And I recall them listing specific items such as that. They can alter, manipulate biological systems, essentially. And I assume they're referring to, when they say that, to inducing physiological effects on people. And they can possibly alter that space-time construct that people often report. So what's all that mean? I'm not sure. I don't know if that gets at your question. Maybe, this is possibly being looked at right now. I don't know what may be being used for this purpose. Are they throwing remote viewers at them? I wouldn't be surprised if they have. They should have. In fact, when I was interviewing Joe McMonagle for our film, The Consciousness Connection, I asked him that question. You ever remote view UAP? And he said, oh yeah, they tried, but not very successfully. There were problems with that. I guess the Russian subs were more easier to detect from his office in the Pentagon for whatever reason. We can only imagine. But he did say he had a strong sense they were interdimensional. So do with that as you may. But it would certainly make sense to throw at least that. I try all our capabilities, and it seems that remote viewing is just one of the more advanced ones, I guess, from a behavioral standpoint. But
well, the reason I like remote viewing, or even people who, let's call them mystics or shamans or mediums, is they can do some of this work kind of on demand. And because they can do it on demand, unlike a lot of the other things that we're interested in this area, which end up sort of happening unexpectedly, there's an opportunity, like with Tyler Henry or other people, to have them work on whatever it is that they can do, or do what they do, and then watch their brainwaves while they're doing it. Or receive. I mean, I'm most interested in the receipt of information that doesn't seem to be currently resident in their brain. And so this somehow relates, or actually closely relates to what Bob's saying, is if consciousness sits elsewhere. So there's two hypotheses. Our consciousness sits in another realm, not in the material, and it receives that information in that other realm. And then that information somehow gets translated into our meat brain. And then, with our primitive tools, we can measure electromagnetic, and brain waves, et cetera. So I'm interested in that interface of when it happens, when the information, or is our consciousness more local, and then the information is received from elsewhere. But again, there's a translation of the information comes from over there, where we don't understand it, to over here, where we think we understand it. And that translation is what I've talked about before in terms of the architecture of the brain, the so-called antenna. Are there particular people who have more, efficient antennas than others? And that's where you can convince a scientist to do an experiment.
Because it's novel. Is that
no?
why?
Because it's reproducible.
Okay.
Because it's on demand. Some of this is on demand.
And some of this is, but most of it is not, right? I mean, it's really, really difficult to study.
I mean, since my youngest age, when I last saw one, I have not. I mean, well, actually, that's a lie. I did see something last year with some people in Long Island, but I haven't seen a UFO. They don't just come when you call them, right?
Right, but that would be a new thing to do something that's unrepeatable. Because I don't know of any study that's done such a thing.
You were saying it before that if UFOs and DMT, these other experiences, are somehow related to each other. And what Bob was talking about before about orbs and other things that, whatever these things are that seem to be able to, talk to people, as people claim, if that phenomena is similar or somehow related to remote viewing, then remote viewing is more controllable than anything else that I've seen, and is at least even believed by the Department of Defense, because they still have those programs that they run them. They call them the Spidey Sense programs or whatever, but they're still being run. They've called them something more innocuous, but they're teaching soldiers how to listen to their intuition. And so those are reproducible events that you can get a scientist to study.
How do you feel about CE5? Could that be
sure
a means of studying it?
Yeah.
Right.
Why not? I mean, it's another kind of signal that at least you're sending. But I don't see that, though, as unless they're receiving information, observing something in the sky could be measured by cameras.
Yeah, I was right. If you can capture it on camera, but also if you are measuring, brain activity.
But see, brain activity alone is not sufficient unless it's accompanied by something that's clearly anomalous.
Right.
Information. I don't want to hear about somebody's mother, right? And somebody telling you that, oh, your mother cares about you. I want novel information.
Right. So then, if there was an anomalous activity within the brain at the moment of, let's say, CE5 when a UFO appears,
perhaps
then you might have something.
That might be something. Yes, you have to correlate it with something. Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to detract just for a quick moment. I have to ask you both: what's your take on the David Grusch interview that come out in a couple of weeks ago?
Bob, you first.
I have great respect for him. I obviously, when I wrote that book on UFO phenomena in 2015, I never could have imagined that's what has transpired in the last decade, has. He's to be commended. Obviously, you're going to have your people out there who's going to look at it as a controversy or disinformation, especially us in the older generation who've been through this way before and learned the lesson. So we may be a little gun shy to some extent, but I have great respect for him and the journalists who broke the story. I know Ralph Blumenthal, and I can't speak more highly of him. I know that his sources are impeccable. So it's certainly moving in the right direction, and hopefully that continues the motivation, and other people speak out and ride the wave.
Yeah, I obviously mirror everything Bob just said. I mean, he's got tremendous courage to come forward. I think the critics are missing the point, though. The point is not his particular claims per se. The point is the amount of attention the government has paid to it, and frankly, the fetal position that they've all locked themselves into, not answering it. I mean, that tells you more, I think, about the value of the things that he said, as well as now all of the senators and Congress people have come forward, and I don't know a one of them who's come forward and said it's rubbish.
Did you have any inkling that this would happen, that someone like David Grusch would be? Because at the SALT conference, I mean, you were quite forthright about your belief that aliens are here, and there's kind of a new paradigm coming out here. Did you sense that more whistleblowers would be coming out?
I knew about a fair amount of not the specifics of it, but I've been talking to Leslie about aspects of this. It's probably all I should really say.
Okay, understood. Yeah. I'm in my early 40s, so I've grew up with the 80s Roswell excitement, right? The fervor there, and then in the 90s that continued on. We had the alien body, autopsy, which turned out to be nothing more than a show. And then we had the Disclosure Project in the early 2000s. Each one of these waves were very exciting, and I feel what you were saying, Bob, that it's like I take it with a grain of salt, because I think it's fantastic, and I think it is courageous to come out and share that story, especially reporting to the IGIC. That's a big deal. He's on record, and he's put himself out there for reprisal or reprimand for speaking his truth as he understands it from secondhand testimony. Now, we don't know what the documents are that he handed in. We don't know if there's any pictures that go along with it that could just blow this thing out of the water and prove everything true. If you had to guess, let's go with you, Garry. Are most of these UAPs we're seeing, are these back engineered, or are these something other?
No idea. Okay. I won't touch that with a 10-foot pole.
Okay.
I mean, it's just speculation on speculation. I mean, One of the things I often worry about with the so-called materials that we see is you can go all the way back to John Fort and just call these things apports. Some of the things that appear to be left behind are, no different than the things which would show up in the middle of a medium's trance, in the middle of the table and drop from the ceiling,
Right.
Allegedly, and so distinguishing something which is left behind from the other kinds of, let's say, more Fortean, is that how it's said, Fortean things, is very difficult. I mean, unless you have a function that you can associate with something, you can definitely say, hey, this showed up apparently out of nowhere. But ascribing a function to it under the right circumstances, I mean, again, as I've said in many interviews, just because it has strange ratios doesn't mean it's alien. Now, if it has a strange structure or looks obviously technological, then maybe I can go a little further.
So form equals function, meaning if you understand the form better, we might be able to then approach it from a different angle.
Interpret a function. I mean, structures are usually context dependent.
And Bob, what about you?
Well, let's say someone like Garry figures it out. It's alien. There's no way it could have been manufactured on Earth, obviously. Okay. That answers something very critical, of course, and it's part of the overall equation. But so what? What's the bigger question? Is there a bigger question? That is, what does it mean? What's the purpose of it being thrown down here, which is so certainly bizarre and makes no sense, or this isotope was tweaked a little bit, or just these things disappear out of nowhere for no reason. It all this reminds me, again, getting back to what is a UAP, what's an orb, how do we classify it, define it, what sense, especially when do we make of it, especially if we have to use maybe some novelty with this, and we have to have more than out of the box thinking to wrap our minds around this, because this is so much more complex than our brains are capable of figuring out. Nor do we, and on top of that, this is only Newtonian physics that we're dealing with. We're going to need something a little bit more sophisticated, whether it's quantum mechanics, who knows, but it seems more promise. Look, quickly, goes back to the plasmoids, the earthlights. Yeah, I know. It may have been written off as not being UAPs, but maybe not.
Of course they are, 100%.
Well, I agree with you. Exactly. Massimo Teodorani, astrophysicist that has down lights, he worked on these, studied these for over a decade. Through the scientific method at the end, you got to read one of his papers. He considered it, sparing of the details, intelligent. They respond to light. There's coincidences and synchronicities associated with them. There's an intention to communicate. Now, go back about 20 years to the United States. Harvey Rutledge in Nebraska. He studied the same thing, astrophysicist. He came away in different time, different place, came away after a decade of studying it with the same conclusion: intelligence. They want to communicate. Okay, may mean something, may mean nothing. I know. But then you start thinking about plasma, fourth state of matter. What research has been done? Well, Baum threw some electrodes in a plasma medium and said they started to interact like a cohesive whole, which is analogous to that of a primitive living cell. Now, I'm not going to argue with Baum, but that was also backed up by plasma physicists in Russia. I forget the name, Sisovich, I can't pronounce it, who came up with similar conclusions. These are primitive life forms. Let's study them more. I don't know the current research on the matter. So I don't know where I'm going with this. Could we be dealing with a separate life entity like an octopus, only it's in the sky and interact with us and in some way has some rudimentary form of intelligence and can morph and shape and alter our consciousness? I don't know. Speculating at most. Don't interpret this literally in no way, shape, or form. But my point is, I strongly believe that we have to define these orbs versus structural craft versus, I don't know.
It's interesting that you say that, Bob, because the movie Nope came out last summer, and that was kind of the idea. That was this kind of just the predatory thing. Not that we're talking about a predatory, life form here, but that was a pretty interesting idea. That it's something that we just can't understand. There's something living around us that we can't see. I mean, obviously, there are materials now where that create either like a translucent effect or a cloaking effect. And paint that can do amazing things, right?
Yeah.
So we're
Well,
just go ahead. Yeah.
The CE5s, using consciousness, meditative practices, etc., and that's cool. I went to one up in Tampa. Mike Merberg, great bunch of folks. We had a blast. Okay, sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not. I know Dr. Joseph Burke's HICE, H-I-C-E, Human Initiated Contact Experiences. He used to work with Stephen Greer and has been very successful at using mental intention via these group meditative practices. And the point is, are we considering during a CE5 that when particles act in resonance, like in the brain, quantum processes versus maybe these orbs where there's potentially quantum processes, plasma, and establish a connecting bond? Like Garry said, he's interested in that interface. I'm not sure if this is an interface between the brain and that other. But we behave with it like a cooperating entity in a way, and that's like one wave function. And then if you take it quantum, physicists, they have a field day with this, because then they start talking about, well, there's quantum processes within plasma, maybe the same quantum processes that's within the microtubules of the brain that Penrose and Hammerhoff have proclaimed, that the orchestrated reduction theory,
Right.
Contending, and it's highly controversial that conscious moments are generated every time the microtubules are activated. In other words, well, there's more to it than that, but the wave function essentially collapses, and
Right.
maybe that's what happened. Maybe the wave function is collapsing when we interact with these orbs and receive messages or whomever.
Right. And Gary, I know we're kind of in a speculative zone, but that idea of like measuring, plasma, instead of just electromagnetic frequency, right? And then how weird would that be if our brain created some kind of similar effect that a UAP would? Are there things that we should be measuring that we're not, that we should be looking for when we're studying these things?
Well, I mean, the only things we can measure are what we understand about the electromagnetic spectrum right now.
Yeah.
And but I think that belies the sensor that is the human consciousness, right? That has, if anything, entree into that realm.
Right.
Right. If there's any sensor we have which can reach into that realm, that has shown some, let's say, reproducible function, it's our brain. Right. So it still comes back. So, I mean, something else I've sort of talked about before is that, let's say that the orbs are some kind of orchestrated consciousness. Our brains sit in the matrix of space-time. I mean, we can talk day and night about what I think this pen is and material, et cetera. Our brains organize space-time. And for better or worse, that creates a consciousness. It's what we think is a consciousness. And so who's to say that once that consciousness is somehow organized, it needs to remain resident in the thing in the vessel that created it in the first place? I mean, you'd call that a soul, maybe, right? So, I mean, maybe these things organize themselves some other point in time, or what have you. And talk to Eric Davis about Boltzmann brains. But Eric didn't come up with Boltzmann brains. One of the first ever greatest physicists came up with the concept of organized space-time, plasmas that would be capable of independent movement, thought, reproduction, Maybe everything we're seeing today was created way back at the beginning of time, and the beginning of the universe, and just of all the possible atomic organizations that could have occurred back when the Big Bang occurred, maybe a few of them had self-awareness or self-replicability. There's a great story I remember from a woman, I think it's a woman, her name was Alison Tillior, about a consciousness that had evolved somewhere. It started, the short story started with, it could not remember, but could deduce its origin.
Huh.
Right?
Yeah.
And so we can't remember, but we can deduce our origins. And so maybe you're talking about something else, these orbs. But I am frankly, if anything, more fascinated by those things than I am with the material objects that are basically,
that's strange. Not strange. It's interesting that you would say that, because the material objects you can actually test.
I can test them, but it's unlikely I'm ever going to get a hold of anytime soon. And
right. So, well, hopefully, we'll knock on wood.
But these, at least the ones that I'm most interested in. But I think these orbs, whatever you want to call them, are, they've been seen for thousands of years, and they're probably more reproducible than some of the other stuff. For all the reasons that Bob was talking about.
Right, exactly. So kind of on that. Oh, go ahead, Bob.
Well, we have the limited research that we've done. Kathleen Marden's done, John Mack's done to some extent, but too few and far between. There is an obvious physical component, and as Jacques said, and Alan Hynek back in the 70s, is a symbolic and physical manifestation here, and we have to look, I think, at the physical and the non-physical as two separate phenomena, maybe, because people who have interactions with these beings that are physical in nature, where they're physically claimed to be relocated on board a craft, we know what goes on there, their reports of that experience are different than the reports by those who claim to interact with non-human entities not associated with a structural craft, meaning what they describe as consciousness, expanded consciousness, floating up to that matrix, as I mentioned earlier, like it's like an OBE. That's sort of an integrative, symbiotic relationship with something else. So is that something distinctly different than what's on top of Devil's Tower, in the movie? And it may be. That's something we need to look at in terms of future research. Something that we got to get over the hump right now and scratch the surface. These are questions that remain to be addressed in future generations, more than likely. But to distinguish the kinds of interactions based on thematic and semantic content of what people are saying. You see, we don't have the qualitative information, the descriptions, the essence of the experience, everything about it, from sensory to emotional, transformational in terms of long-term outcomes, etc., that are detailed in nature, reproducible by independent researchers, etc., that help us better understand it, but again, from a qualitative, anecdotal perspective. But that's critical. It's essential, because that's more meaningful, because there's no physical attached to it. You're going to put brain waves and biologic activity in the brain on top of that. Well, I don't know if you need to. That's not the heart of the matter. The heart of the matter is in the people's hearts and what it does to them over time, and trying to make sense of it, especially in a society that lacks the support, which is changing, of course, in terms of providing that needed support.
Right. I've only been a UFO witness. I haven't had like a close encounter, but I can tell you that certainly changed, my mind for the rest of my life. I've been kind of pseudo obsessed with the topic, right? And integrated with that is the paranormal and spiritual aspect of it. Spiritual, I use that word very loosely. I'm not a religious person, but yeah, there's something almost magical about it and these encounters. So, have either of you ever done a psychedelic or anything like that? No. Okay. So I heard Neil deGrasse Tyson recently say that he wouldn't ever want to do that because it could affect his rational approach to the subject of consciousness and life after death and that sort of thing. Do you think that makes sense, or do you think it's okay to kind of step into that realm and be able to?
I wouldn't advocate for it because it can be dangerous in the wrong hands, and so if anybody tries it, it has to be well supervised and by an experienced person under very careful conditions in the right environment, and be very cautious of it. And I don't advocate for it at all,
Right.
but beware.
Wait, so I missed that. It kind of cut. There was some noise here. OBE, did you say?
Oh, no, taking a mind-altering substance like a
Oh, I see.
psychedelic to understand consciousness more, is that, or if there's life after death, if there's a reality beyond, is that, can you do that as a scientist, as an approach?
Scientists are doing it, but I mean, but again, I think it's best done first from a therapeutic standpoint, right? I mean, where it's being done right now around things like PTSD and depression, and because the crazy questions, or what many people would think are crazy, are not the first things that you want to ever walk out the door with saying you advocate.
Yeah.
The first thing you do is you say, I think this is important for health, for mental health, and I mean, because of the people with whom I interact with in the government, a lot of them are of, let's say, a political persuasion far to the opposite of me as an academic type. And yet they're the ones, frankly, these days pushing the psychedelics the furthest because of the remarkable results that they've seen with some of their colleagues from the battlefield and how it's helped PTSD and depression. I mean, it's extraordinary. I sit there thinking, frankly, sometimes I'm at Burning Man with some of the conversations that are going on around this.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's the beginning, because by doing it that way, you're doing the right kind of medical science. You're making sure, as Bob was saying, it's all done under the right kind of supervision, psychologically, metabolically, et cetera, for the right reasons.
Right.
And then once you set that baseline, then you can start asking some of the more interesting questions like, does this change perception? Does it influence intuition? So what is really intuition? Is intuition, so the difference between insight and intuition, insight is kind of like what you had on board already mentally, and you're able to process with the information on board. And intuition is sort of that extra step, at least what we think of it as, that you're reaching into what scientifically we would call sparse data or lack of data, and then somehow pulling an answer out of the vacuum.
Okay, so I asked a couple of fellow podcasters if they had any questions. So I'll put this out to you now that either of you can answer. What have you learned about UAP since studying it that we don't already know?
Oh, Bob, you go first. That's a hard one.
What have I learned from UAPs?
About
UAPs that we don't already know. And that's from UFOT, Angel at UFOT.
I don't know. I don't have an answer to that off the top of my head. I have to give that thought. It's a tough one.
Well, I have an answer is that we say we know very little already. So, I have a very hard time nailing down what this actually really means. I remember the first time that I was sort of getting into studying this, at least studying it, looking it on YouTube back in the day, and then realizing after I had convinced myself that UAPs were probably real, even though I'd had my experiences before, and then realizing how close it was to many of the other things that we call paranormal. And it was like, well, I already got myself over this hump. How am I going to deal with this fact that it appears to be related to these other things? If we've learned anything, it's that it's just very hard to define, because every time, well, Jacques often says this, every time you nail it down as one thing and you make a conclusion, somebody comes along and shows you that it's something else. So
yeah, very true. And I'm getting back to that point. I haven't given it some thought. I used to read about literature. I was a closet ufologist in a sense since a teenager. How can you not be growing up like us during the 60s, flying up to the moon? So I, of course, always came across stories about how people interacted with these beings. And it was difficult for me to interpret that literally. I needed evidence. I loved reading almanacs, when I was a kid. I wasn't a normal kid, I couldn't enjoy Moby Dick back then. So, but now when I've talked to people, I said, can you give me evidence as best as you possibly can that non-human intelligence exists? And some Reverend Michael J. Carter, you know him.
Yeah, love Michael. Yeah.
Bob, a great touch me. What's that, Mike? Bob, a great touch me. So the point is, I learned this from the literature a long time ago, and it took me I never experienced it directly, but yet I believe him because he's such a well-balanced individual, and I've met so many more. That's the point. It complemented what I read, and it provided me with that sense of knowingness that it has to be real. And my research with Free just, hit the ball out of the park as far as that goes.
And then the other question is from, is there anything more to come of the Atacama mummy? Is that it? Is there any, can we do any more study?
The only thing that can come is somebody proving me that I was wrong. I dare them. I really do.
That's pretty confident.
Dare them. It was human. I'm sorry. I had 15 people on that paper. The graduate students were the ones that did the study. Anybody who wants to claim I'm a fraud, say it again. I dare you. And perhaps Stanford will see you in court.
Yeah, that's a shame. And again, it speaks to that behavior that we kind of talked a little bit about earlier on Twitter that we see. That sort of malicious character assassination behavior.
It's a great question. I don't mind answering the question.
Yeah.
And the original question of what was it was completely fair.
Yeah.
It was completely,
it was weird.
I wouldn't have done the work if I didn't think there was something interesting there. Right. Yeah. But science takes the things off the table. It was the most extraordinary, claim. I thought it was interesting. But there's the interesting stuff is always the stuff that's hidden in the dust. It's not the most obvious stuff.
And that would have been an obvious choice, right? You look at that and it's, yeah, go ahead.
The interesting story is all of the people who think over the thousands of years that they've seen the little people, right? It matched a narrative that is common to all of our cultures. And so that's the interesting part. And that's that's unanswered. There's nothing I did that changed, the work of thousands or the observations of hundreds of thousands of people over hundreds of generations.
Yeah, that leads me to this question. I know we're running out of time.
Alan, it's like telling somebody who believes in UFOs and non-human entities more than they believe in the back of their hand, and you come up to them and you criticize them. You say it can't be true, that kind of thing. Well, it's like attacking them. It's like attacking their God. People view it that way. Some people will. So you have to be very careful how you critique. I'm not saying everybody's like that, certainly, but the point is, you have to be sensitive to people's feelings in this field, because UFOs to many people is God, is spiritual. So it adds another layer of complexity to the social interactions that occur among us. We don't know sometimes who we're talking to, because you could be attacking their God. I kid you not.
That's true. That's a really good point. And that, and that's one of the benefits of Twitter too, is that, and other social media apps and what have you, is that kind of collection of ideas and thoughts that we get to learn. So I want to get this in, being an amateur, researcher, investigator into the phenomena. I know how I feel. How important do you both feel about the amateurs that are out there doing work on their own to investigate, UAPs, and it could be any other
Well,
kind of paranormal phenomena?
we're all amateurs. Even the scientists, they're better amateurs, but we're all amateurs relative to what we're studying. They're the intelligence, they're in control. And I think no matter what we throw at them, we'll still be at their mercy. And they'll feed us information we're only allowed to maybe obtain or understand, with certain restrictions or impediments for some reason. That's my gut feeling.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't have any problem, and I agree completely with what Bob just said. I mean, I don't have a problem with amateurs or lay. I mean, I just call them lay people. It's data. As long as you're careful about the conclusions you make from the observations that you have, and as long as you're professional about how you interact with other people publicly and don't disparage them and their thought processes. I mean, I'm people say because I'm the head of a laboratory at Stanford, I got like 30 people in my lab. The ideas come from the students. They don't come from me usually, right? They come from the students. They're this foment of speculation and ideas, and that's where the real, I don't know, the creativity is. They're the eyes and ears around the world.
Yeah.
Why not?
I'm catching myself shaking my head as if I have any idea what it's like to be in your lab, but I get the idea, right? That collective brainstorming in a sense,
Yeah,
right? Yeah,
exactly.
and the idea of just collecting as much data as possible, because you may not even know what good that data is until later. So you might as well collect as much as you can, right? Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah. I mean, it's data, but it's up to somebody to find the patterns in the data. And so, as long as there's not too much noise, and as Jacques often likes to say, you just got to scrub the data and make sure that you bin it correctly, so that later it can be put into a spreadsheet. I mean, I was once at Jacques' place, and he has these two screens with a spreadsheet that went for about 300 columns in that direction for each event of each of the attributes of either the observation or the event that had occurred. So that's kind of what needs to be done. And then you assign a value to a scoring of each of the attributes.
Yeah.
And because, garbage in, garbage out kind of problem. So people think that artificial intelligence is going to solve everything. I think if artificial intelligence solves everything, it's going to decide to get rid of us.
Yeah, I mean, I hope not. I do hope we do put in some measures to prevent that. So, okay, guys, we're at the end. I don't want to hold you much longer. So, real quick, Bob, do you feel that there is any real movement towards an actual disclosure, let's say within the next 10 years?
It depends on what you mean by disclosure.
Okay, like the government saying, or the DoD saying, hey.
Yeah, they already said that, UFOs are real. That's disclosure at one level. There's many layers of, I guess, stages of it as things evolve. When will we reach the point where, and they present on 6 o'clock news, of course, the being, so that everybody can see on maybe Jeopardy or something like that. That's going to take a while probably, and that's not going to be up to us more than likely. But yeah, within 10 years we'll make great progress. Who knows? I never thought this would occur 10 years ago, and yet it has. So who knows? I think I'm very optimistic. People like Garry Nolan, I can't speak more highly of what he's done, and he's not alone, but he's quite unique. And my hat's off to him for many reasons. And we certainly need more academicians and well-established scientists like him. And unfortunately, we don't have it. We don't, and it's sorely needed.
Yeah, I'll say related to that, what Bob just said. So I was at Stanford graduation on the stage, handing out PhDs to people. And the guy who sat next to me, another scientist, was a very famous person. And Carolyn Bottozzi, the Nobel Prize winner from last year, was giving the presentation for the commencement. And he was like, Garry, I really love what's going on and all. Can you please tell me some more about this? This is I mean, and he was, and I sent him a whole bunch of emails. And somebody else at the chemistry graduation, which is a much smaller affair than the medical school graduation, came up to me and said, Garry, I want to talk about this. So things are changing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in archaeology, it used to be civilization started 6,000 years in Mesopotamia. I mean, and now we know. I mean, it's undeniable. It goes back much further. So it's really interesting. Okay. So final thoughts, Bob. Whatever you want to share.
I want to share. I just wanted to mention, Alan, if you don't mind, I want to mention that I'm in co-production for a planned film called The Consciousness Connection. And for those interested, they can find it online at consciousnessfilm.info. Whatever you can do to support the film, that'd be great, because much of it is largely based on the things we're talking about.
Yeah.
And beyond, and your support is greatly appreciated. So, and in fact, Garry Nolan will be in the film, and we'll be filming him sometime this year or early next year.
All right, nice. And Bob's other website is bobdavisspeaks.com. And Garry, what about yourself?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Final thought, share anything that you'd like.
Don't let other people tell you what you know to be true. Right? Don't wait for daddy disclosure to show up and tell you what you know to be true. Again, there's a difference between anecdote, and so think about how you can translate your anecdote into a reproducible and observable and measurable event. That's what we need more people thinking about.
Right. Okay. Perfect. Garry, Bob, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, gentlemen. A pleasure.
See you soon, Bob.
Okay, and thank you all for joining us for Coffee and UFOs. I hope you enjoyed this Bruin chat. If you like this podcast, please subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts, and on the YouTube channel, that's youtube.com/Mystic Lounge. Peace and love to you all, and until next time, be well.